thank you, Emilia and Christian, for organizing this webinar. I think that these kind of webinars at these very moments when around the world and specifically in Mexico, we are having so many issues regarding coronavirus. Well, it comes in a good time because, as you know, a lot of our companies are already working or planning the next future for our operations. So this kind of webinars with learners will help us to assess for new opportunities to come. It's a fact that a lot of companies are already working for growing greens of some several years, but I think that this challenge coming from the crisis from COVID will speed up the way that we are planning to do the things, and I really think that we need to adapt for the new so-called normality that it's coming, no? So I will thanks in advance for the expert that we are having today for this panel. I think that will be helpful for all of us to understand how other companies are already working on this issue, and let's listen about them, about new alternatives or new opportunities that we can find in the future coming. Thanks, Emilia.
Thank you, Gabriel, for your words. And now I will give the floor to Yael Gutierrez, Governments and Institutions Manager at SGS Mexico. And she's also the coordinator of the International Trade Working Group at the Swiss Mexican Chamber.
Do you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Emilia, Christian, Rodrigo, for this webinar. We are grateful to be here. I only want to say that it is really highly relevant to energy, economic, and foreign trade conditions for all the companies that are members of this Swiss Champ, and that we are interested in the development of the conditions in our country. The world is facing new challenges, and it's essential for Mexico that we cannot be left behind in the issues that lead as a new reality that we live today. Thank you very much. I really want to say that enjoy this webinar, and thank you.
Thank you, Yael, and thank you, Gabriel, both of you for your words and also for coordinating two of our working groups. So now I am happy to introduce you to our first speaker, Andrew Binland. He is a director within the Redefining Value team at the World Business Council of Sustainable Development based in Geneva. In this role, Andy leads the work of the reporting exchange and the annual reporting matters review process and also publications. He is also responsible for monitoring and evaluation for a number of WPCSD grants. So if you are ready, Andy, I hand it over to you so you can share your presentation with us. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Amelia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And then you're going to share the presentation on your screen and move the slides on. Great. Well, firstly, thanks for your very kind invitation to speak at this webinar. I'm really excited to share some of the work that we've been working on. I actually worked with Amelia a couple of years ago when she was at WPCSTR, so it's really nice to reconnect with her and share this work. So perhaps just a little bit of background. So if we can move to the next slide on who WPCSTR are. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a global CEO-led organization of 200 forward-thinking businesses are working together to accelerate transition to a sustainable world. We're trying to accelerate this transition by making more sustainable businesses more successful. And we're united around this common vision to create a world in which 9 billion people are all living well and within the planetary boundaries. And if you move to the next slide, you will see that there's actually quite a significant overlap between some of the members that we have and some of the members of the Swiss Mexican Chamber of Commerce. So it's nice to make those connections. Next slide, please. So our work is structured around six programs, 6 key systems that we need to transform to get to that Vision 2050. So it's around circular economy, It's around cities and mobility, around getting to net zero, climate and energy, around food and nature, around people, and around redefining value, which is the area that I work in, which is focusing on how to get to a more sustainable form of capitalism. So Sunday in the Northern Hemisphere, if you move to the next slide, please, so in Sunday in the Northern Hemisphere was the summer solstice. So that kind of means the sun is halfway, the Earth is halfway around the sun. And let's just say, looking at this, this graphic, that we're not exactly where we thought we would be 6 months ago. I think no one would have kind of expected to see the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had. You know, our world has been turned upside down in the space of half a rotation around the sun. Next slide, please. In this presentation, we're going to examine the kind of the effect of COVID-19 on the decade ahead. And this really builds on the work that the WPCSTR team and our members have been working on over the last 18 months, which is a review of our Vision 2050. And what we're trying to do there is sort of setting how to accelerate the transition to a world in which 9 billion people live well within the planetary boundaries. This presentation is based on 2 issue briefs that have been developed with our partner Volans, and those are both shown on the screen here and are available to download from the WPCSTR website. And as this webinar may be recorded, I owe a big thank you to my colleagues for all the work that they put into developing those 2 resources. So we're going to look at and examine how COVID-19 is revealing how fragile some of our sort of essential systems are that our society relies on. We're going to look at how the crisis and the way that business responds to it could shape the next decade. And we're going to offer some thoughts on how business can ensure that the global response supports this transition to a more sustainable world. On the slide now is a volcano, and this is a metaphor that my colleague Julian Hill-Landot uses to kind of discuss the disruptions that we have identified for the decade. And I think it's really quite a good metaphor. You know, COVID-19 is this volcano. Volcano eruptions aren't black swans. We know they're going to happen. We have tools to measure them, and neither is COVID-19. We knew it would happen. There's plenty of scientific research that shows that there was a fair chance that there would be a global pandemic. But ultimately, being prepared wasn't something that global societies were willing to invest in. And even once it was occurring, the cost of reacting maybe seemed too high. Next slide, please. So as part of our work on Vision 2050, we've been looking to create a picture of the operating landscape for the next 10 years. Because we need to understand the environment in which we'll be doing business to address sustainability challenges with any hope of success. And like other forecasts, we identified that a pandemic was something that the world was ill-equipped to deal with if it were to occur, and actually something that was quite likely to occur. But I think still we find ourselves stunned that it arrived within the first weeks of the decade. And you know, this is really powerfully demonstrating the profound and wide-ranging and long-lasting consequences that disruptions can have. And what we're seeing is COVID-19, it can accelerate and intensify many of the macro trends that we've identified. I think my video went off for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. Hopefully it's back on now. So for instance, it's making an economic crash an almost absolute certainty. The OECD is estimating that by 2021, the loss of income will have exceeded any previous recession outside of wartime. So essentially what COVID-19 doing is kind of bringing things up the agenda that we were going to have to deal with anyway, but now we really have to deal with them. Similarly, what COVID-19 crisis is doing on a very tragic number of levels is detecting how important it is to take into account wildcards and disruptions into planning. If you move to the next slide, please, that'd be helpful. Yeah, so we identified these kind of 10 wildcard disruptions that could affect the next decade, and we really didn't expect 4 of them to be playing out within sort of 4 months of the decade. And what we're all seeing in real time is that there are clear linkages between these disruptions that have domino effects, where one triggers others, and that becomes a very real possibility. So, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, disruption 2 on this list, is triggering a financial crisis that may trigger a major conflict, that may trigger popular uprisings that lead to regime change. And these disruptions are likely to interact with one another in a way that kind of creates reinforcing feedback loops. So if one of them happens, others are likely to happen too, and we need to be prepared for that. Next slide, please. So I think most significantly, what COVID-19 really has exposed is the huge vulnerabilities in our entire economic and social systems. And I think there's kind of 5 key things that it's really exposing. Firstly, it's exposing this dependence on economic activity and growth. We know that the response to the pandemic is triggering a significant drop in global demand and production. Most countries, there's been a trade-off to a certain extent between the infection rate and economic impact. Millions of businesses, billions of people's livelihoods are at risk. There's a clear question around how can we stimulate a recovery if people are unable, or maybe even too scared, to go back to normal spending habits. How do countries go back to normal in the absence of kind of social protections for those who are unable to or cannot now work? So the degree to which social stability and welfare is depending on constant economic growth is a clear source of vulnerability. The second area that it's sort of exposing is these sort of huge levels of inequality both within and between countries. People's experiences of the pandemic are likely to be determined by where they sit on the wealth spectrum. Wealthy people, those in wealthy countries, may have more of a financial buffer or a strong social safety net. They may have access to high quality healthcare. They may also have a garden which helps see them through periods of confinement. Those at the bottom have none of those things. So this inequality is really acting as a magnifier, and that increases vulnerability of society as a whole. And COVID-19 is also exposing how the changing nature of work and employment has become a real source of vulnerability. In many countries, the number of contractors, freelancers and gig economy workers has exploded in recent years. And these workers are typically gone amongst the first who see their livelihoods threatened by the pandemic. The third area where we see the vulnerabilities being exposed is around the kind of the weakness and norms of institutions that enable coordination, collaboration. That both applies within countries and between them. The lack of coordination in the way that governments and other actors are responding to the pandemic has demonstrated how badly the sort of institutions designed to facilitate collaboration have been eroded in recent years. Transnational institutions from the G20 to the EU have been largely sidelined, and in the US, there's been reports of individual states and hospitals being left to compete with one another for medical supplies, which is obviously driving prices up and causing all sorts of chaos there. And really, a failure to confront the pandemic in all countries is likely to lead to recurring outbreaks as economic and travel lockdowns start to lift, and we're already starting to see that sort of second wave occurring in some countries. The kind of fourth vulnerability that we've identified is this underinvestment in healthcare and scientific research. That's not a surprise. We should have probably been acting as if a pandemic would occur every 3 to 4 years. And COVID-19 has overwhelmed the health systems in the world's richest countries and exposed how far we are from achieving universal health coverage, in both high and low income countries. And underinvestment that's undoubtedly a contributing factor, but it's also a result of health systems that are focused on disease treatment rather than developing effective public health strategies. And then finally, there's this very much a focus on efficiency at all costs and short-term value by business. Much of the corporate world is fine-tuned to maximize efficiency. but unfortunately, resilient systems are characterized by the type of features, diversity, redundancy, slack, that efficiency destroys. So that just in time needs to become just in case. And they're kind of like the excessive focus on short-term financial value maximization, and coupled with a buildup of corporate debt during an era of very low interest rates has left many companies kind of ill prepared to deal with the economic shock of the confinement and the economic slowdown. So next slide, please. So, so in exposing these vulnerabilities, we see that COVID-19 is kind of is amplifying existing demographic and social and cultural divides. So we know that COVID-19 affects different groups differently. You know, the old are more vulnerable than the young. Men are more at risk than women. The rich are so better protected than the poor. And I've touched on this already, but I think there's sort of like 4 key points. Those at the bottom of the wealth and income spectrum are going to be hardest hit. That's clear. They're least likely to have access to healthcare, and many cannot afford to stop going to work, putting themselves and others at risk. Meanwhile, those at the top of the wealth scale are sort of most exposed to the kind of a crash in global share prices, which we're starting to see a little bit. COVID-19 is also highlighting the sort of the strength of nationalism and this weakness of multilateralism, and we're seeing tensions growing between trading partners. But I think ultimately there needs to be a solidarity needs to be chosen over isolation, as the pandemic is going to remain a challenge until the weakest countries have been able to bring it under control. Finally, there's this challenge around intergenerational dynamics. So we know older people are those that most likely face the greatest health risk in the pandemic, but in the longer term, the economic fallout will be sort of disproportionately impact the young. Those entering the workforce for the first time in the 2020s are going to face very adverse circumstances. Many will struggle to find jobs at all. And there's a risk that all these growing divides could lead to more polarization in society. That said, in some instances, we've seen COVID-19 bringing communities together. It's fostered a spirit of solidarity and responsibility, and also creating a new level of awareness of interconnectedness and interdependence. It kind of remains to be seen how much of that solidarity will persist, but maybe there is a hope for a sort of a strengthening up of from the bottom of social fabric. Next slide, please. So we also see that COVID-19 could be shape and accelerate existing trends. The very nature of events is they often fast forward historical processes. And there's kind of 4 key things that we think COVID-19 may accelerate. So the first one is reshoring. What it's doing is prompting companies and governments to rethink where critical supplies are coming from. This is the trend to bring in production close to consumer markets. It was already happening, but this is likely to accelerate as a result of the crisis. Digitization, the lockdown in many countries has accelerated digitization in many parts of the economy, e-commerce, remote working, presenting on webinars, etc., and of course schooling. And some of these behavioral changes are much more likely to stick as a result. We're also seeing that the challenges and disruptions are almost turbocharging technological innovation, from medical research to the race to develop a vaccine to the deployment of 3D and design and printing. Surveillance is also a trend that is kind of being accelerated too. So many states have rapidly deployed existing surveillance technologies to help monitor and slow the spread of the pandemic. These emergency regulations may outlast the pandemic, and they're sparking a clear debate over data privacy, which will need to be addressed. And finally, this autocratization. So during the last decade, we've seen the number of companies moving in authoritarian directions overtook the number of countries moving in a democratic direction for the first time since World War II. And some authoritarian rulers are using this crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power and to a certain extent to suspend democracy. Next slide, please. So I think it's kind of really important to think about what the post-crisis recovery will look like. The design and implementation of government policies is obviously going to play a crucial role in determining what the long-term legacy is. And there are clear lessons to be learned from the response to the 2018 financial crisis. Then the bailouts seem to benefit those who had caused the crisis. This created a perception of unfairness and to a certain extent sowed some seeds of the populist backlash we've seen in some countries. We can't afford to repeat the mistake of socializing the losses and privatizing the gains that were used a decade ago. But I don't think that means that sort of austerity or bailing out unprepared corporations is guaranteed. Prioritizing the interest of workers and small to medium-sized enterprises and choosing targeted public investment and tax reform may be a better form of or a better recipe for recovery. We're starting to see this, where I'm based in the EU, we're getting a sense of the direction of travel. The European Commission has already proposed a 7-year, 1 trillion budget, and the recovery plan is heavily focused on sustainable and digital transitions as a path forward. Next slide, please. So I think what this also provides us an opportunity to think about is this an opportunity to reset capitalism as it currently exists? The COVID-19 crisis has revealed the weakness of the capitalist system, and we sort of touched on some of the trends that it's likely to accelerate. Shareholder capitalism has undermined resilience at all levels. That's clear. It's created a lack of financial and supply chain resilience in the pursuit of efficiency. It's resulted in sort of underinvestment in preparedness for shocks. It's given incentives that sort of drive companies to offer precarious rather than stable forms of employment, and it's left vital public services underfunded. So I think shifting to a more stakeholder-oriented form of capitalism becomes more, not less important in the wake of COVID-19. The economic consequences are going to put a severe strain on social and political stability, and we need to ensure that recovery is inclusive, benefiting all stakeholders. And the other sort of key point, I think, is that we need to put into place new models of partnerships and collaboration between business and government investors. The post-crisis reforms, will not automatically align with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord, the 1.5 degree scenario. So collective ambition and leadership is going to be essential. The term building back better has been already overused, but this is vital. So we believe this kind of government business needs to kind of expand to match the recovery. We think one way of looking at this is through the 3 R's. And I hope everyone can still hear me, because I just got a message to say my internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me, Amelia? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. I just thought my internet was going to crash. Yes, through this 3 R's approach: responsibility, resilience, and regeneration, which are terms coined by John Elkington, the author of The Triple Bottom Line. So I think to date, responsibility is the principal frame for which companies have viewed sustainability issues, and that's a critical imperative that must remain. But as we move to post-crisis phase, this resilience and regeneration are going to become increasingly important. Building resilience at all levels, from individual businesses to supply chains to the global economy, has to be self-evident. And regeneration matters because it's only by regenerating economies and communities and the biosphere that we're going to be able to achieve sort of true resilience. So I think there's 3 ways that companies can get a head start on this. Firstly, it's by adapting corporate governance and how decisions are made. Secondly, it's about removing from risk management to resilience. And third, it's about moving from reporting to transparency and communication with all stakeholders. So next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice for business? So next few slides, I'm just going to share a few resources that we've been working on at the World Business Council to help our members with this adaptation. And these are all freely available resources, so hopefully you will find these useful. So when this crisis subsides, boards are going to be judged by whether they demonstrated diligence for their employees, their customers, or their communities. And I think this quote from Mervyn King sums it up nicely, particularly the last paragraph. We cannot social distance from climate change. It's going to envelop all of us. So the time is now. So as part of WPCST's governance and internal oversight project, we've created a suite of resources, which is the link on the screen, to support boards in the integration of environmental and social considerations into decision making and their existing governance responsibilities. So I'd highly recommend you check that out. Next slide, please. And if we need to move, need to be more resilient as companies, that means that enterprise risk management has to evolve. When countries went into lockdown, we conducted some research to assess the extent to which companies identified pandemic.
So whoever is in Mexico, just feel free to go out of the building and read this presentation because it's being recorded, and then you can catch it up. Keep safe. Okay.
I'm sorry to hear there's an earthquake alarm. Hopefully everyone's okay. So I'm just wrapping up. So we looked at basically 55 companies and only 6 made any reference to pandemics in their legal risk disclosures as a potential risk. I think that shows, as we've highlighted in previous research, there's this disconnect between how companies assess and integrate environmental, social, governance risks into their ERM processes. The guidance that's shown on the screen here is one tool that's available to support companies with that process. So again, it's a free resource. I would highly recommend you go and check it out. And then finally, just to wrap up, there's we see that there's the way that the COVID-19 pandemic is influencing kind of reporting and external disclosure. Deadlines for financial reporting have been extended. Sure. Okay. Well, I've just had. It seems very very minor now to wrap up with my final slide, known as an earthquake going on in Mexico City. But my last couple of points were just we're starting to see that kind of additional guidance and requirements on disclosure as a result of sort of COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, in Canada, the government is offering financial support to companies, but they're requiring them to publish annual climate-related disclosure reports in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures in return for that support. And sort of going forward, we see there's going to be sort of increasing scrutiny on in corporate reports on the kind of preparedness and response, and articulating sort of financial concerns such as impact on revenues and profits. And also pre-financial issues such as business continuity planning. Companies who fail to get their reporting right, they may be sort of punished by investors or other stakeholders. And I think finally, maybe just to conclude that we're seeing that reporting and disclosure can be enabler for recovery. There's kind of an accelerating agreement between private sector bodies, regulatory standards, and investor audiences that disclosure on ESG topics is vital. We have an online resource called the Reporting Exchange that kind of tracks all this information. So I'd kind of point people to that if they want to stay up to date with the latest developments. And then, yeah, just to conclude, I'd say if you'd want more detail on those macro trends, the COVID-19 impacts, there's this briefs available on the WPCST website. So thank you all for your time. I hope everyone's stayed safe given the earthquake. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Perfect, thank you. Andy, thank you very much for your presentation. It is very, very interesting to learn about how the crisis is accelerating some of the trends, to bring them into today's agenda, and mostly to understand that the answer to it can also be part of the way things will be shaping in the future. So before passing to our next panel and defining if we can actually continue with our next panel, I would like just to do 2 brief questions. So the first one is coming from the Clariant CEO in Mexico. He's asking, with an economic crisis after COVID, would it be possible to live a real green economy, considering that unemployment will be at high levels and purchase power heavily affected? And someone else wants to know if there are any companies that have been more resilient to face the crisis because they have integrated environmental and social risk into their corporate strategies before the crisis.
Okay, so I can answer the second one. The first one may be a little bit more tricky. So one of the things that we looked at was how so the market performance of companies that are WPCST members as the as the market downturned. And what we're seeing is that obviously sustainability isn't an indicator of big business success, but it can often be seen as a part of good business. So what we're actually seeing is the WPCST members in Europe kind of outperform the kind of the benchmark by about 4%. So what we think that's kind of indicating is that investor interest and confidence in companies that are managing sustainability issues well, ESG issues well, either through more integrated enterprise risk management, through integrated reporting, are weathering this difficult time better than those that aren't. And on the question around can a green stimulus be the sort of path forward? I think that sort of kind of entirely depends on what corporates push for and what governments are kind of able to support. If there's the recognition that the current...
Yes, I think we lost Andy.
Hello, sorry, my internet crashed.
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Andy, very much for your presentation. It has been very interesting and for inspiring us about the way next trends can be accelerating in the next decade and how business needs to act to respond to this. So thank you very much. And I would like to pass to our next panel. So now I would like to introduce you to our 4 panelists. So first we have Ian Roberts, who is joining us from Switzerland. As I said, he is the Chief Technology Officer at Bühler Group since 2011. Ian is also Chairman of the Evaluation Board of the WIS Institute Zurich. He is also President of Mass Challenge Switzerland, which runs 5 accelerator programs across Europe. And he's also a member of the supervisory boards of Protix, which is an industrial scale insect processing company, and of Squirrel, that it's an artificial intelligence company. Then we have Maria Mülli, who's also joining us from Switzerland. She is the business development manager of Micro, a Swiss company that invents urban mobility solutions like scooters or small electric cars. Then we have Clara Arriaga. She is Environmental Health and Safety LATAM Manager at SICA Mexico. and she has led the company's strategy about more value, less impact during the last 5 years. And finally, we have Montserrat Benitez with more than 10 years of experience in regulatory and corporate affairs. She joined Syngenta in 2013, and currently she leads the sustainability agenda for Syngenta in the Andean countries, Central America, and the Caribbean and Mexico. Welcome to all of you. So I would like to start with a question to Montserrat. As a leading agriculture company, we know that Syngenta has an important influence in the food and agriculture value chain. Now in the presentation just before, we heard about the importance of non-financial disclosure and the need to tackle urgent challenges such as feeding a growing population, but within the limits of the planet. So Montserrat, can you tell us how is Syngenta taking action to face these challenges, and if COVID-19 crisis had brought new needs to be considered into the supply chain?
Hi, everyone. I hope you're all safe. Due to pandemics and due to earthquakes in Mexico City, that was the last thing that we needed currently. But yeah, I can share a bit about what Syngenta has been doing, not just in the framework of the pandemics, but of course that now that we're within the situation globally, we have to set we have bigger challenge, and we have to face them in more intelligent ways. So can you go to the next slide, please? I always like to set a bit of the scene regarding food production, and especially from agriculture. So I would like to take a few minutes of telling you where we're standing today. So by 2015, the world will reach a population of 9 billion people. This is the greatest rate of increasing population that we have ever had, and this has a lot to do with technology too. We have better vaccines, we have better medicines, we have better treatments to some illness, and we can cure them at the fastest rate of the whole world. And the next slide, please. And it also has to do with the food, the safety of the food that we're consuming and producing around the world. But the growers that produce current food will need to produce 70% more food for the next years to help the population have access to food. But they don't only need to produce more food, but they need to do it while taking care of the environment, which is extremely big challenge, and they have to increase the yield of the different crops around the world in the same surface. As Emilio was saying, we don't have more soil, we don't have more planet, so we have to produce more and taking care of the environment. The next one. And there's also something that I want to say, that climate change is a fact, despite that some leaders around the world don't believe so. And it affects directly to the growers around the world and how food is being produced. And such as the pandemics are things that we are not able to control. So we have to be prepared to and be resilient to them. Next slide, please. So basically, the thing is that we have to be sure that technology, and we in Syngenta, that's what we strive for, that technology will help the grower to adapt, to become more resilient, not only to climate change, but the future scenarios that Andy was sharing with us. And we have to protect the environment and increase the productivity. So the challenge is really big, and we have to define how are we going to do it. The next slide, please. So after setting this scene, I want to share with you some of the commitments that Syngenta made 6 years ago now. We set this plan, the Sustainable Agriculture Plan, 6 years ago, and now we have to see, and we're going to present how are we going to continue with this focus on sustainable agriculture. So basically, we decided to focus in 3 axes, and we decided to design a global project where more than 50 countries participate in the economic axis, because we know that if growers do not see a benefit and a benefit in their income or in their productivity, it's really difficult for us to get them to start focusing in environment or in social issues. So the economic access that we have been presenting has to do with making crops more efficient. We have increased and we promised to increase about 20% of certain crops around the world. And this has been made by incorporating technology in the way that food has been producing, that food has been produced. And then the orange axis has to do directly with environment. We have decided to focus on farmland and the health of soil, because it doesn't matter that we as a company design a super novel technology if we don't have a good soil where to put a seed and make it flourish adequately. And then we have to focus a lot in biodiversity around agricultural landscapes. And the blue part has to do directly with the social impact in agricultural communities and how can we empower smallholders to adopt this technology and to start producing food with a better focus and a more sustainable focus, by helping people stay safe using adequately our technologies and technologies in general, and look after every worker, including fair labor association parameters on how farm workers should be working in field. And this of course has to do directly with the sustainable development goals. We have aligned all these commitments with how globally we're trying to face this issue. And after 6 years, we have some incredible results. Can you go to the next slide, please? So sorry, this slide is in Spanish. Usually I have to apologize the other way around. But these are the results that we have been presenting from 2013 to 2020. We reached our goals by last year, by 2019. So that's what I was telling you, that we decided to launch 1 year earlier our sustainability plan. And we have reached 42.4 million people around the world, smallholders particularly, that normally faced bigger challenges on not only producing food, but doing it in a sustainable way. And we have increased almost by 20% the productivity of all our crops. That probably we're in the city and we do not measure the impact of increasing 20% a crop of corn or tomato, but this has impact directly in the life quality of growers. And we have reached 8.2 million hectares on farmland regarding biodiversity, and we work a lot with this trying to make a different way of agricultural landscapes, and so on. So we're really proud of what we have been accomplishing. Of course, Mexico plays a really important role in these results. And if we can go to the next one, please. We are about to launch in a couple of weeks the second phase of this program, that will include, of course, a new vision that we were planning to launch in March, and then the pandemic came, and we are trying to incorporate. We have been taking these months to incorporate the new scenarios and the new reality of the world that we're living, and including in the sustainability focus from food producing. So now I want to talk a bit about how COVID-19 has been impacting agriculture and food produce. I was recently, reading lots of things, but there are two articles that I wanted to take here to discuss, and both of them agree in lots of things. But there's one statement on the Economist article that I wanted to share with you, is that this is the first time in human history where we haven't been facing a food crisis from the beginning of the pandemics. In 1918, with the Spanish flu, one of the main concerns, along with the illness, was the food shortage that was practically from the beginning. And for these months, we have been able, at least in the Western world and in first world countries, the racks of the supermarkets haven't been empty for a while, and this has directly to do with the strengthening of the food supply chains, and how from the growers the food production has not stopped in the current scenarios. But that doesn't mean that that could not be something that happens in the near future. And UN has been warning in different statements that we could be facing the worst food crisis in the last 50 years. But I want to take the positive facts of this, and can you go to the next slide? And I think that sometimes we really need positivity. But one of the facts the three facts that are more relevant for me is that today the global food chain has nearly tripled since 1970. As the population has grown, doubled to 7.7 billion people around the world. So the food chain has been growing impressively along with the population. The other point is that the number of people who have had too little to eat has fallen from 36% to just 11% of the population. And this is impressive for me because sometimes we tend to go to the past and say that we were better before. Can you go back, please, to thanks. And another important thing is that a bushel of maize today or a cut of beef costs less than 50 years ago in real terms. So we are, I wanted to take this to punctualize that we are in a better place now that we have been in the last years. And this has to do directly with technology and with a lot of sustainable focus that we have to do within agriculture. Now, can you go to next one, please? So basically, I wanna set 3 takeaway messages. The first one is that agriculture never stops, not in a pandemic, no with climate change pressures, and that growers cannot do home office and cannot take a time for them. So we have to be clear that there are other things that we can depend on someday within a month, but you will depend on an agriculture and on a grower and agriculture for three times every day. The second point is that due to that, we need to build a global recovery that prioritizes health and environment sustainable food system. And that's a big challenge. It's not that we just need to produce more, but we need it to do in a better and a more efficient way and in an environmentally friendly way. And the third one is that the responsible use of technology is the answer. That's the focus that we have in Syngenta as a technology and R&D company, is the answer to a lot of questions and challenges that we're facing. That agriculture supplies are at the beginning of a successful food chain, and that we have to focus. I think that we sometimes do not understand that technology is in every food that we eat. A tomato has a lot of technologies, not just it's not just in communications or in medicine. Technology starts in the seed that we put in the soil to grow a healthy plant that will be later food for people. So we as Syngenta have this really clear, and we know that agricultural supplies that we provide and that we research on are the beginning of this successful chain. So basically, that's what I wanted to share with you. And thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Montserrat. It is very, very interesting to see how companies such as Syngenta are implementing smart targets, and these ones are aligned to sustainable development goals to tackle challenges mostly at the beginning on the food value chain.